If everybody will grab a seat. Everybody will grab a seat. We'll get started. Well, good morning. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Andrew Krepinevich. I'm president of the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. We're delighted to have you. I just see our board chairman, Nelson Ford, coming in. Welcome, Nelson. This is, I can't keep track of the number, but we've been doing this for about 20-odd years now. So this is one of a series of events we've had looking at issues related to defense policy, defense strategy, and defense budgets. The topic, of course, is sustaining a strong defense posture in an era of austere budgets. And we're very fortunate to have with us this morning Congressman Adam Smith. By way of introduction to the topic, obviously we're in a period now where there's a lot of talk about revisionist powers and increasing security challenges to the country, but we're also in a period of austere budgets. And one of the big issues is how do you reconcile the difference between the two? You come to realize that no country, no matter how powerful it's ever been, has been able to eliminate every threat to its security. And so the question is, how do you use the resources that are available to minimize those risks and those threats as best you can? And there's a number of ways to do this. None are mutually exclusive. You can use some or you can use them all. Hopefully you use them all. One, obviously, is to just increase the amount of resources that you devote to your defense. That's not on the table right now, at least not on the the immediate horizon. Second is to ask your allies to do more. And I see some smiles. Quite frankly, if you look at the trend lines, our allies are beating us to the bottom when it comes to cuts. Third is quite frankly to say we're going to increase the risks that we have in being able to meet some of our commitments. But the problem there is at some point you cross the line where accepting more risks makes you, in the eyes of your allies, less reliable or perhaps unreliable. And in terms of your adversaries, easy pickings, or at least willing to test you and push and engage in coercion and aggression. You can also become more effective. And it's interesting, the administration is going to be coming out with its new national security strategy soon. But when you increase effectiveness, you're using the same resources, but you're generating more military capability out of it. And a great example is after the Battle of Midway, Admiral King, the Navy CNO, said, I'm not going to use 40,000 tons of steel to build battleships. I'm going to use 40,000 tons of steel to build aircraft carriers. And for those of you with the knowledge of military history, at that time, the advances in technology had put us into a new competitive era in the maritime competition where carriers have become the capital ship, displacing the battleship. And finally, and perhaps this is something that perhaps we should all really agree upon most easily and most readily, is to improve the efficiency with which we undertake to protect our defenses. And that really is the focus of the discussion today. As I mentioned, we're very fortunate to have Congressman Adam Smith with us. You have the agenda, and you also have his bio in your pamphlet there. So I won't go through all the details, but I would like to emphasize one thing. I think we're very fortunate to have men like Adam Smith serving on the Armed Services Committee, particularly in a position of leadership as he has been in. A thoughtful member of Congress who really has developed an impressive expertise on these issues from which we can all learn and hopefully benefit from his leadership. With that, let me get out of the way and turn things over to Congressman Smith. Sir?
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here, and I really appreciate your work and CSBA's work on these issues because they are incredibly important. I think much of the debate when it comes to national security policy People get caught up in weapons systems and scenarios, and the nitty-gritty work of getting into each program and each system, what really works, where are we going to save the most money, where are we going to get the most bang for the buck. That's the hard stuff, and this group does it better than anybody else, and it can lead to smarter decisions and better savings. If only you didn't have Congress to worry about in terms of going from those ideas to implementing something. Well, if there is a theme for my talk this morning, it is our budget situation, our national security situation going forward is worse than most people are aware of. I say most people because I don't want to be presumptuous and say I know there's many in this room who have looked at the numbers. But I think we are still stuck in the notion, as you look at how we're trying to deal with the 2015 NDAA on appropriations bills, we're trying to sort of move deck chairs around and try to save this program for a year or try to save that program for a year without really sort of looking at the big picture and the problems that are out there in terms of our strategy and how it matches up with the budget that we are likely to have. And it doesn't match up. It doesn't even come close to matching up. And I think, an instructive way to think about this is the administration, I forget, it was 3-4 years ago now, maybe less, sort of took a look as Iraq was pretty much wound down, Afghanistan was going to be winding down, and they said, okay, this is a good opportunity to take a look out 10 years and say, what should our national security strategy be? What are the threats that we're going to have to be most concerned about? How best are we going to meet those threats? And then, what are the resources that are going to be available during that period of time? And what makes sense? What sort of budget national security strategy can we build for a 10-year look? And at the time, they came back, and then they looked at the number that was projected to be spent. And that's where it gets confusing when you talk about cuts. We're usually talking about cuts from projections, and we always have these projections. Any day of the year, you have a 1-year, 5-year, 10-year projection as to what the Department of Defense expects to be able to spend. Well, at the time that the administration did this extensive study, they came back and said, well, we're going to be able to live with roughly $500 billion. I think the exact figure was $487 billion less than we thought we were going to have over the course of the next 10 years, and began to implement a strategy based on that. And there was criticism of that from a variety of different places, but it amounted to a national security strategy within a realistic budget framework. And that was great until 2011, when the Budget Control Act came into being, and sequestration and government shutdowns and threatened government shutdowns and continuing resolutions instead of appropriations bills, which also are very upsetting to any effort to budget. So basically, that 10-year look got blown out of the water by the fact that there turned out to be even less money available for it. So what now? And I think it was reflected in the budget that the president submitted this year. He submitted it, but then also asked for an additional $28 billion in plus-ups. They offered offsets. It appears Congress is not going to take them up either on the offsets or on the additional $28 billion to defense. And then also for the FIDIP, for the 5-year period, they asked for an additional $150 billion. 150, 105, I always forget which number it was, but somewhere in that neighborhood. So basically what they were saying was, look, the budget numbers that you've given us, we don't think match our national security strategy. They've been accused in the past of building a national security strategy around the budget, and as many of you have heard me say, this always struck me as an odd accusation in the sense that resources are always part of what you have to consider when you're building a strategy for anything, and this notion that we should just totally forget about resources when we're planning a strategy, I think is not just ridiculous, but it's dangerous. If you build a strategy around money you don't have, you're going to wind up in a bad place. I think it's good to do it the way they did 3-4 years ago, which is, okay, what would we like to do? And then, okay, here's the money, so okay, we can maybe trim here, trim there, and we can still get it done. But you've got to look at your resources. But what the administration did this time is they looked at it and said, there are not enough resources to meet the national security strategy that we think we need. And that sort of illustrates the problem. And then as you go forward, past 2014 and 2015, there are 8 years of sequestration that are still on the books, that are still the law of the land. And I don't know of anybody who is overwhelmingly optimistic that there is a path to get rid of those 8 years of sequestration. There is, the differences that existed that blew up the grand bargain a little over 3 years ago, or about 3 years ago, are still there. And I won't walk through them. You all know what they are. The bottom line is, at the end of the story, it's no deal. And if there's no deal, and if you have 8 more years of sequestration, you are looking at substantial cuts to the discretionary budget, over half of which is the defense budget, and you're looking at substantial cuts. So not only will the administration not get their over $100 billion over the course of the next 5 years, they'll get substantially less than that. And how does that impact individual decisions? Well, I think the most instructive way to think about this is to look at the fights that we're having right now in the NDAA. We are in a situation where there is not money in the president's budget to refuel the 11th aircraft carrier. For 1 year, that's like $700 million. We're scrambling around trying to find $700 million to refuel one aircraft carrier. We've got the cuts to the A-10, the elimination of the A-10 program, and what that's going to cost. You've got the battle between the Guard and the active duty in terms of not just in strength numbers, but also with the Army, their helicopter fleet, their air fleet, where they make the cuts and how they move that around. Then you've got personnel costs, which fall roughly in 4 areas at the moment: healthcare, the subsidies for the commissary, housing allowances, and pay. The administration has cuts in all of those areas that save a certain amount of money. Now, what we're doing right now is we're battling over the 2015 dollars. We're trying to find a little bit of money here, a little bit of money there, in order to get us through 2015. But the big problem here is the bow wave problem. And this is before you even get to sequestration. The A-10, for instance, I think I saw, if we can find $400 million, we can save the A-10. That's a daunting challenge in this budget environment, but it's also not realistic, because if we save the A-10 this year, over the course of 5 years, the cost is $3.5 billion. Where are we going to find the other 3.1 over the course of the 4 years? We've just created a bow wave. Same is true with the personnel costs. The costs to reduce pay raises and do all those other things I mentioned for FY15 are relatively small, but it's $2 billion over 5 years. So what do we do in FY16, even if sequestration doesn't happen, but especially if it does? So the big problem we have right now is we are avoiding all of these difficult decisions, and we are simply scrambling to get through the day. I mean, the analogy that always occurs to me is, we're painting ourselves into a corner, and we're going to run out of floor space at some point. Now, the odd thing about budgets is you always wind up having more floor space than you thought you had. So you can say, well, gosh, we could find a few $100 million over here, we could do that. But when you run out of space, you are in a really bad situation, and you will run out of space. So the illusion that, oh, look, there's a corner over there, we can go ahead and paint it, we're good, let's go on, is just that, an illusion. So if you imagine for the moment that we have sequestration going forward, what are the budget choices? When I say it's worse than it looks, what does it look like? Well, let's just start with the Navy. We're having this huge fight right now over whether or not we should keep 11 carriers or go down to 10. Well, if sequestration kicks in, we're going to have a devil of a time keeping more than 8 aircraft carriers. Because keep in mind, we build 2 submarines a year, 2 Virginia-class submarines a year. We build 2 destroyers a year, and at the moment we build 3 littoral combat ships a year. That eats up a huge chunk of the budget, and once sequestration kicks in, our ability to do those things is going to be challenged. And those are core parts, and that doesn't even talk about replacing the Ohio-class ballistic submarines and putting a program forward on that. So you will see the Navy squeezed substantially in those areas. On the personnel side, we're bringing the Army and the Air Force, Army and the Marine Corps down. The Army's coming down to like 440. They say they'll go to 420. And then the Marine Corps is down to 172, I guess one way or the other with sequestration. So those are substantial shrinkages that are going to be locked into place. We're also, in terms of aircraft, the F-18. We are concerned, we acknowledge that there is going to be a need for more F-18Gs, but we don't have the money to buy them right now. And Boeing does not think that they can keep the line open for 2, 3, 4 years waiting until we do have the money to buy them. And that is the other big theme of this reason that it's worse than it looks, is the industrial base issue. We could conceivably, as we did in the 90s, we did a procurement holiday, as it was called. I guess we could do that. But the problem is the industrial base will not necessarily be there 2, 3 years down the road for any manner of different programs. Certainly on the aircraft, on the submarines, on the destroyers, all of that. We're seeing it with the Abrams and the Bradley, with the idea that, well, we'll take 3 years off, then we'll come back and buy them. But the industrial base is in jeopardy on that, because they'll go off and do something else, and you cannot necessarily pull all those people back in and start building tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles. So you get a picture for the size and scope of the problem. Now, what can we do to address it? Well, the one thing that we're doing right now that is making it worse that we can fix is that we are fighting every single one of these cuts. We are still back in a world of, we need to be parochial and protect what we care about, and not looking at the world of sequestration. We're not willing to do anything to get rid of sequestration, but we are going to say, no, we're not going to accept it. We're going to try to keep all this stuff going. Instead of saying, okay, if this is going to happen, what are the smart decisions that we can make now that put us in a better position to deal with that? Now part of it, there's, we're going to do procurement and acquisition reform and a whole lot of efficiencies and that's all great. Number one is unpredictable, how much savings you're going to get out of it. And number two, it doesn't solve the problem. So one of the things we need to do is to accept some of these cuts, not because we want them, but because it's a choice. It's a zero-sum game. If you want to keep the A-10, you're going to take $3.5 billion out of the budget somewhere else. And I just described that budget. There's not a lot of room. If you're going to continue to give pay raises and continue to maintain health care and the subsidies for the commissary and all of that at a certain level, then that's a lot of money that's got to come from someplace else. I really do believe that the Pentagon, in presenting their budget, did a pretty decent job of looking at this and saying, okay, here's some smart, hard choices we can make now that will begin to save us money, to put us in a better position to deal with some of those challenges going forward down the future. And yet we are getting in the way of all of those. The Guard issue is a major, major issue. Certainly the size of the Guard is a piece, but the larger piece is in the aircraft. The Army estimates that they can save $12 billion over 5 years by this little complicated maneuver of moving Apaches and Kiowas and other aircraft around. That's $12 billion. If we fight that and stop that, that's $12 billion that we have to make up. So I think we need to embrace these ideas. One other one is the 8 cruisers and 3 amphibious ships that we want to lay up for a while in order to save a little money in the short term. I think that, too, is an important thing to do. The number on that, I believe, is $4.5 billion over 5 years. Every year we fight that simply creates this larger bow wave problem. So what I'm saying is, if we don't take those steps that the DOD put out, and I think I mentioned most, if not all of them, then we are creating a completely untenable situation that down the road will have us looking at very, very dramatic things like not being able to buy submarines, like not being able to maintain 10, much less 11 aircraft carriers. Not being able to have an Army that's even 420,000. Much less the 440 that they would like to have. So we've got to start, looking at this from the standpoint of tough decisions and choices, not, I don't want to do that, I don't want to do that, I don't want to do that. Well, none of us, to a certain extent, want to do some of these things. Now, some of them actually, I think, do make sense, regardless of the size of the military. But resisting those things puts us in a really bad position down the road. So we have got to accept where we're at financially and then build a military around that. Now that raises the question, and Andrew, I think you laid out fairly well, what choices do you make as you cut? We're going to have levels of risk that 2 or 3 years ago we would have said were unacceptable. If sequestration happens, we are going to have levels of risk that 2 or 3 years ago we would have said were unacceptable. And if someone has a different plan, I hope they will tell me this morning, because I'd love to see it. But if we have sequestration, we are going to have to accept levels of risk that we did not think we were going to want to accept. What are they? It's time to start making those choices instead of trying to say program by program by program so that 2, 3, 4 years from now it's just chaos. It's just there is no strategy. It's just a matter of what can survive the political environment and move forward. And the final thing I will say before I turn it over to your questions and comments is the worst thing that we can do is basically what we're doing, which is to protect program after program after program, reject those cuts. Because what is the first thing to go in that scenario? The first thing to go in that scenario is readiness. That's the easiest place to cut. You use less fuel, so you fly less, you train less, you repair less, you provide less ammunition for training, and slowly you create the hollow force that everybody said that we didn't want. Because what a hollow force is a force that is of a certain size, but it is not trained and equipped to do the mission that you have asked it to do. And I think that would be the greatest dereliction of duty of Congress, to create a hollow force that is not prepared to go fight. And we've heard in committee, many times the examples of, the U.S. military in North Africa in World War II, how totally unprepared they were. The first group of our troops that we sent over to Korea when the Korean War broke out, how completely unprepared they were. Whatever our mission is, let's make sure that the men and women that we ask to do it are trained and equipped to do it. And we are headed down a path right now where that will not be the case. Where, okay, we keep those 11, those 8 cruisers, 3 amphibious ships, we keep those floating, all right, but that comes out of readiness. We keep 11 aircraft carriers, but that comes out of readiness. We, protect the Guard, make sure they don't get shrunk, make sure they don't lose their helicopters, but that comes out of readiness. We keep the A-10, that comes out of readiness. We don't do anything on personnel. That too has to come out of readiness. And pretty soon you're adding up to a really large number, and you have a military that is not properly trained, not properly equipped, and not properly maintained. Now, if somebody has a different set of hard choices than the ones the DoD made, I think that's quite possible. We can see them. We could decide any number of different things. And I'll throw out hypotheticals, and then this way I'll have everybody screaming at me. Adam Smith said that we should. No, it was a hypothetical. But my press person, I think, isn't working hard enough. So we'll go ahead and work that. We could say, we're only going to build one submarine. We're going to stop the LCS altogether. We could dramatically cut the F-35 by. We could shrink the force structure even more. There's a whole bunch of different things that we could do if it came down to that. But I think what the Pentagon has put out sort of realistically reflects the challenges that we face going forward and keeps us with a force that allows us to have a national security strategy, accepting more risk than we would have liked 2 or 3 years ago, but at least is a strategy that can work. But if we resist all of those cuts, we wind up with a hollow force and a less capable force. So it's not a pretty picture on the one hand. On the other hand, as I always like to say, the Republic has survived worse. The defense budget over the course of 10 years from roughly 2001 to 2011 doubled. We spent an enormous amount of money. The competitors that we worry about in the defense world, Russia and China, even if we go into sequestration, are not spending anywhere near as much money as we will continue to spend. We ought to be able to build a national security strategy. Now, The problem with that, of course, is that we in the United States have greater national security responsibilities than any other country in the world. We are the guarantors of security for South Korea and Japan. We are the guarantors of security for Israel. We face a global terrorist threat that no other country really faces in the same way, or the ones that do face it don't have the resources that we have to confront it. So it is not as comforting as it might appear that the countries that we're worried about, like China or Russia, aren't going to be spending as much money as we are. But we will still be spending a lot of money and ought to be able to spend it in a way that gives us a decent national security strategy. But that's the challenge. And like right now, we are clearly not meeting it. I think we need a more realistic look at what those challenges are going forward, and we need to get in position to start to step up to it. So with that, I think I'll take a seat and be happy to answer your questions. If someone could grab me some water from the back there, that would be great. Oh, yes. One step.
Thank you, Congressman. That was it was very great, very enlightening. I think you hit a lot of the big points that many of us in the defense community have been talking about for years. I wanted to go through as a budget analyst myself. Of course, I can't go anywhere and do anything without slides. Fair enough. So of course I prepared a few slides. And I wanted to start. I'm going to throw up some information here and then ask you to respond. A few weeks ago, DoD put out a document called the Estimated Impacts of Sequestration Level Funding. And in that, they did what many of us have been asking them to do for several years, is to specify exactly what they would do if they had to live with these budget caps under the BCA, if they're not repealed and they have to live with them all the way through the end of the decade. And when they did this, there were a few surprises for me. Now, these are additional cuts beyond the cuts already made in the FY15 President's budget request. So under sequestration, they would make additional cuts to the Army Active Guard, Reserve, in strength, and BCTs. Same in the Marine Corps. They would have to cut that aircraft carrier. The USS Washington would not get refueled. 6 additional destroyers to put in the layup. The Air Force would lose a attack air squadron, F-35As. They would retire the entire fleet of KC-10 tankers. They would cut 10 Predator Reaper combat air patrols. And they would divest the Global Hawk Block 40. So all of those cuts, of course, those would be debated by Congress as well, and people are not going to be happy about those, and that would be in addition to everything like the A-10s and the changes in the Guard and Reserve and the active component in the Army. What was interesting to me is what would not be cut. What they showed us is that there would be no additional cuts to civilian personnel in any of the services or the defense agencies. Marine Corps Reserve in strength would not be cut. Amphibious ships would not be cut. Attack submarines would not be cut. Navy TAC air squadrons would not be cut. And the Air Force Guard and Reserve TAC air squadrons would not be cut. So my question for you is, looking at these estimated impacts of sequestration, are these the right areas to be cutting strategically, looking forward if you have to live with these budget caps? And will the threat of these cuts be sufficient to spur Congress into action to replace or repeal the Budget Control Act?
On the second one, it doesn't seem like it. You never know. I mean, we managed to get an agreement on FY15 and FY16 when we didn't necessarily expect to. And I think ultimately what got us to that point was that people began to see the impacts of sequestration and the impacts of the Budget Control Act. And there was an impetus to do that. The cause for less optimism is that the FY15, FY16 deal was basically, we took 10 years savings and spent it in 1 year. Or 2, in this case maybe, and there's only so many times you can do that. So it's possible that when people begin to see the impact, and by the way, I know we're talking about defense this morning, but you could spin through a scenario on the rest of the discretionary budget, on infrastructure, talk about our roads and our bridges, and the impact that sequestration is going to have on an already difficult situation there, on housing and healthcare. So people who care about other policy areas are going to be facing just as stark a choices, and will that be enough of an impetus to get us to change it? I'd bet against it, but it's at least possible. And the first question as to whether or not these are the right cuts, the first thing I'd say is this is crazy optimistic, okay, in terms of, being able to maintain. If they think this list of cuts is sufficient to get them through 8 years of sequestration, I can't believe that they think that. The cuts will have to be deeper than that. And I do think that part of it is going to have to be on the civilian personnel side. I think that's one mistake that's in here, is not looking for opportunities for cuts in those areas. But I would also say that if we're going to do that, we have to cut contractors as well. And I think that's, the big argument is that it's got to be pretty close to 1-for-1. You can't just cut civilian personnel and then you contract it out and you wind up not saving any money. So that's the way I'd respond to the first chart.
Okay. And then let's dive right into one of the third rail issues here in defense, and of course that is compensation reform. So, proponents of the current compensation system like to argue that, military compensation as a share of the overall base defense budget has actually remained about the same during this buildup, about a third of the base defense budget, and that's shown on the left-hand side here in this chart. It's absolutely true. Of course, it actually has started to change already and is taking a greater share of the budget, but not by much. But what that masks is that it's about the same percentage of a much larger budget, and the size of the force really hasn't grown. We've stated about 1.4 million in active duty end strength, the same as we were before 9/11, and it's actually, the end strength has started to come down already. So, what has actually happened is the cost per service member has grown significantly, and that's shown on the right-hand side of the chart here. Even adjusting for inflation, we've seen growth of more than 60% in the cost per person. And so the fact of the matter is that we, for the same amount of money, we cannot afford the same size force that we had before this buildup again. So my question for you is this a serious enough issue that Congress should actually start taking action this year and considering and accepting some of the proposals in the President's budget request to lower the cost of people? Or should it wait for this congressionally appointed commission to finish its work and it's going to report back out in February?
We should not wait. It is an important enough issue. When you look at where we're at in terms of, the numbers that I talked about earlier, the impact of sequestration, the things that are going to have to be cut, we should not wait. We've studied the issue fairly thoroughly. I think the Pentagon, the proposals that they've made on, less of a pay increase for the troops, no pay increase for, officers above a certain level, looking at things like the commissary, looking at housing. We've got to start finding savings in there sooner rather than later. And again, the longer we wait, the steeper the bow wave.
Yeah. Would it be possible, for Congress to go ahead and accept some of the changes this year, kind of as a down payment, and if the commission comes back and recommends something different, you could adjust next year? Do you think that would be politically feasible?
Well, you see, you changed the question. You asked if it would be possible, and then you asked if it would be politically feasible. Yeah. Certainly it would be possible, and I think it would be advisable. It does not appear to be what we're inclined to do.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Go on to the next issue here, talking about the DoD civilian workforce. I like to point out to people that this drawdown in defense spending is really going to be different than previous drawdowns because the buildup was different than previous buildups. In previous buildups, when the budget went up, the size of the force went up. We added people. And then when we had a drawdown, we cut people. In this buildup, as I said before, the size of the active duty military really didn't change. It didn't go up much, and that's what's shown here in the line on this chart. But what we did see is a growth in the civilian workforce, and particularly from 2007 to 2011, we saw a growth of about 16% in the DoD civilian workforce, while the active duty force was staying roughly level. Now, if you look at projections, our active duty military end strength is already projected by FY19 to decline by 14% from its peak, while the civilian workforce is only projected to decline by 6%. And as I mentioned, the Pentagon planning for sequestration shows that they would make no additional cuts to the civilian workforce, even though they would make additional cuts to the active duty force. Now, our active duty force is already the smallest it's been since the end of World War II in total numbers.
Yeah. Very deceptive stat, by the way, as you well understand, because before the end of, before World War II, it was like 200,000, 250,000. So yes, it's always been bigger than that because it went way up, obviously, for World War II. But it's still roughly twice the size of that pre-World War II force. So,
yeah, we're at the level of about 1948, pre-Korean War. Is where we are in active end strength now. And it's a very different force. You don't necessarily need as many people to do the same, have effective military power. But my question for you is the total DoD workforce, is it becoming unbalanced between military and civilian? And is there something Congress can do to help that along, such as reforming the RIF process?
Yeah, as I understand it, yes, we could more greatly empower the Secretary to make personnel changes. Again, happy to do that as long as there's a balance on the contractor side, as long as we're not simply replacing civilians with contractors. Because I think that too, and that's not illustrated in your chart here, but I think the explosive growth of contractors has also been a significant challenge.
Well, that's been a problem for DoD, is the way that they contract for services is they don't contract by the head, they contract by the pound, by the dollar. And so they don't have a good count. And so that's something DoD could certainly do better understanding. The next one, always want to get into the hot button issues, BRAC, base realignment and closure. So in this budget request, DoD again requested another round of base closures. Congress has rejected this in the past, and I'm pretty sure they'll reject it again this year. It's not a popular thing to do in an election year. I think part of the reason, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, that Congress is resistant to another BRAC is they've got a bad taste in their mouth from the previous BRAC, the one in 2005, because it costs so much more than anticipated, and it actually cost more than all previous BRACs combined, and the savings are taking longer to recoup that full cost. So do you think, first of all, is another BRAC necessary? And if so, how should we go about it differently this time?
Yes, and absolutely another BRAC is necessary. That's something I meant to mention in my remarks, and I'm actually going to offer an amendment on the floor to authorize a BRAC. Look, I understand the politics of a BRAC, but you go back to the 2005, 2006 BRAC, and there's a bunch of misunderstandings about that. And one of the big things is that BRAC was primarily realignment. It was more realignment than closure, because that was in the middle of the force growing. So it wasn't going to have as much savings as the previous BRACs that were more about declining the size of it. And the Army will tell you that they have 25% more infrastructure than they need. So yes, we need another BRAC. Again, with sequestration coming, the savings that we can get from a BRAC, it will be a much less cost, much more savings than 05 and 06, and we need it in order to preserve many of those programs that we're all fighting to preserve. So absolutely, we need another BRAC.
All right. And my final question before we open it up, the questions from the audience here, is about OCO funding. I've tracked spending on Iraq and Afghanistan, and looking at Afghanistan in particular, as shown on this chart, there's been a remarkable consistency in the cost per troop deployed in Afghanistan. So if you take the total cost of operations in Afghanistan, divide it by the average number of troops deployed there in a given year, it's hovered around $1.3 million per troop per year. That's been our cost of being there. And that was true, that held steady through the surge in 2010 and 2011, even when we were putting many more troops in there, many more equipment. 1.3 million per troop was the average. All of a sudden in the 2014 budget request, it jumped to over 2 million per troop. I did digging in the budget, and by my estimate, DoD appears to have moved in 2014 about $20 billion from its base budget O&M accounts to OCO accounts. They just reclassified it as war-related. And then in the appropriations process, Congress came back and moved another $10 billion from the base budget to the OCO budget. So about $30 billion in the OCO budget for 2014 was actually funding in the base budget. So that did a lot to offset the sequestration cuts for 2014. Now, both Congress and DoD have been more than willing to use this loophole. The reason it's a loophole, of course, is the OCO funding doesn't count against your budget cap under the BCA. So do you think this trend of moving things from the base budget to the OCO budget is going to continue even as we come out of Afghanistan?
Yes.
And is it risky for DoD in the long run?
Well, I don't know that it's risky for them in the long run, in the sense that, in the long run, the OCO money's going to be gone anyway. And believe me, this is one of those sentences that I'm going to say that is wide open to misinterpretation. But they may as well do it. Because the cost down the road to them is going to be no greater than if they don't. So I don't think it's risky to DoD in that sense. You know, if you're concerned about the deficit and the debt, it's risky to the budget to spend money in this way, so-called off-budget spending. It's one of the mini games that's played in order to sort of work your way around a finite amount of resources. But in answer to your questions, yes, I think they will continue to do it. No, I don't think it's risky to the DOD. I think the risk to the DOD is, you know, sequestration in the coming budget cuts.
I mean, I guess I worry that that it's masking the true impact of sequestration. If we had had an additional 30 billion cuts in 2014,
Right.
You know, the pain would have been more intense, and maybe people would have been, you know, thinking about the problem differently. Maybe eventually, the local money's going to go away, though.
Yeah.
So.
No, I mean, the pain strikes me as, you know, pretty intense as it is.
Yeah.
Would an extra $30 billion in cuts have pushed us over the threshold? I don't know, because keep in mind, I mean, one of the philosophies that's out there, and certainly amongst, you know, many of the more conservative members of Congress, you cannot possibly cut enough from government. And I'm not kidding, okay? There are, I don't know, 50, 60, 75 House Republicans who, you know, basically feel that you cannot possibly cut enough from government. And I have not yet encountered the situation where they say, okay, well, yeah, the government needs to do that. I think it's been shocking even to some senior Republicans on the Armed Services Committee, the degree to which their colleagues have been willing to let the defense budget be cut. And you know, I'll be as neutral as possible in saying that. I mean, they got elected because they feel strongly that the federal government is simply too large, and that there is one and only one issue out there, and that's cutting it. And that's you know, a passionate political belief. So you know, I understand why, but that's the situation it puts us in terms of dealing with defense budgets and other aspects of the budget.
All right. So it wouldn't necessarily change their calculus. They just want smaller
Yeah,
government.
it might,
Yeah.
but as I said, I have not yet encountered the thing that changes that calculus.
All right. Now I want to open it up to questions from the audience and see my friend
One
here.
quick question. When you say you're going to offer amendment on brac on the floor, on the House floor or in the full committee markup?
The House floor, we've got this really weird thing about sequential referrals. You would think that brac would not be a sequential referral, but apparently it is. So we would have, in order to offer it, I'd have to get a waiver from a different committee, which I think is government and oversight, and that waiver is now coming. So we'll do it on the floor.
Pat?
There's a defense industry, and then there is a defense debate industry. There are people, smart, earnest, serious people who
I would love to get into the defense debate industry. It's so much more fun. There's no actual consequences. No votes have to be taken.
But, you know, Naugus is going to do their thing, and my pals at Boeing and Lockheed will do their thing, and it's
Right.
all, you know, you fight in the last ditch. And I don't mean to trivialize it. They really believe this stuff, as the old Strom Thurmond story goes. But
Right.
then sometimes, while that's going on, at another level, there's a problem-solving approach. And
Yeah.
yesterday, in a Navy Affairs blog that I'm sure many people in the room read, there was a very long posting by somebody who is who would die to save every hull the U.S. Navy has ever launched, about how you would implement the cruiser layup in a way that would save the money, but make the ships a little more readily deployable. In other words, approaching it as, yeah, we got to make the cut, but let's say, I don't mean to focus just on the cruiser thing, but as you look at these, you know, the helicopter thing and the A-10 thing, have you seen much sign, and do you get much sense that there is, at any level, staff, principal, whatever, this sort of a problem-solving approach to, you know, we got to do this, Smith is right, but let's make it a little, do you see any of that going on?
It is going on. The problem is the first part of what you've said, and that is accepting the got to do this part. I mean, the ideas are out there. We can't get over that initial hump to say we got to do this. You still have the people, let's put it this way. You've got those people who are doing exactly what you described. But the people who are still saying we don't got to do this are still in the majority and still driving the debate. We have not gotten to that critical mass of acceptance to then move on to start implementing some of these ideas.
Yeah, hi, Frank Albers. I want to ask you a little bit more. You spoke about your brac amendment. Are there other issues that you think will come up in committee, amendments that you think need to be brought, or that you might bring yourself to sort of offset some of the things that are in the chairman's market?
Well, we're still sifting through that right at the moment, and I don't know. I mean, that's one of the big ones. You know, there's a couple other areas. I mean, I kind of got away, you know, the benefit of forcing a vote on these things with the fact that if you force that vote and you get crushed, does that help? Or does, you know, the next time you come up and say, hey, we really have to do this, they'll say, well, look, you know, the people have spoken. And that's, you know, I mean, I would like to force some of these decisions and debates. But I think at this point, as I said, people are still back in the mindset of we don't necessarily have to do this, so they'll take the safe vote. And then you've got a precedent built to not go there. You know, I mean, like we encountered to some degree with the, you know, reduction in retirement pay as part of the budget deal. You know, the lesson that everyone's come out of that is, well, don't touch that because there'll be a huge price to pay and it'll be reversed anyway. I think that's an unfortunate lesson to have learned from that process, but that's what I'm trying to balance.
Is that across your side of the aisle? I mean, are generally your members on the committee, are they sort of taking the same view? Are we not to expect many amendments on that front, or will they be?
Yeah, well, they're not taking the same view in the sense that there's not many people that have my view on this. You know, I don't know that Democrats are being any less parochial than Republicans at this point. You know, so I think that it's unlikely. Most of the amendments that you will see will be efforts to save one thing or another, not to cut it.
Yeah.
Sir, thanks for your remarks. I think about a year ago when you were at AEI, you were asked a question about American perception, public perception of support of the defense budget. You said the problem is when you go back to your district, as big a supporter you've been of the defense budget, the constituents out there, well, just talked about Social Security, medical care costs, and basically we should have a peace dividend that's come out of these other things. I asked Congressman Thornberry and Congressman Larson last week the same question, and they laughed and said, yeah, we've got to go back to our districts, we've got to go to our constituents. That's what they are concerned about. How much of a problem do you see with that, the American public really saying, why do you need more money in defense? Or what are the concerns?
No, I think it's a significant problem. There's a poll out this week that talked about how, you know, the general U.S. perception is we should be less involved internationally, which I don't necessarily disagree with, by the way. I think, you know, shifting ourselves out of the global policeman role is an important part of foreign policy. That's a different speech. But I think it does contribute to that notion. The one thing that does get constituents' attention, at least up my way, and I think in most districts, is the industrial base argument, is the jobs argument. You know, forget for the moment a more, you know, sophisticated argument about our national security needs. You know, there's a lot of people who, you know, industrial base, those are their jobs. And I think that can bring it to people's attention. Simply saying that we need to spend more money on defense because of this, that, or the other thing. But if you say we need to spend more money on defense because sequestration is going to cost, you know, I don't know, some number of jobs in the Puget Sound region or in any other part of the country, that does get people's attention.
But does that lead us back to the point where members of Congress are focused on their own parochial interest in protecting programs from being cut, like the A-10 or the Super Hornet or the Growler?
You miss the link to sequestration.
Yeah.
You miss the link to what's actually causing it far too often. Some people make the link, but that's the link that has to be made. Well, look, you know, it's the problem, and I've been saying this for years, is that if you look at polling data on what the American public feels about the budget, spending, taxes, the balanced budget, you get a very clear picture, and that is that they want the budget balanced, they don't want to cut anything, and they don't want to raise any taxes. Okay? That's what they want. So you may be able to come back and convince them that these cuts are bad, but then to come back and convince them that they have to either sacrifice, you know, budget deficit issues or taxes, that's where you begin to lose. It's like, can we rework that deal whereby I get this for nothing? That's what I think far too often we're trying to do.
So the only way to make the public happy is to lie to them.
Don't put words in my mouth. I don't, and I don't, and I don't actually agree with that. I think the public is very, very unhappy, with the fact. Look, the reason that the public believes what I just described is because so many politicians have been lying to them and have been telling them that this is possible. When it's not, and justifiably the American public says, wait a second, you said you could do this, this, and this, it's not happening. So I think actually the way to make the public happy is to be more honest with them so they fully appreciate the choices that are involved instead of trying to pretend that those choices don't exist.
With regard to getting the public to understand some of the choices that they're facing, 70% of the budget is entitlements, and a chunk of the discretionary budgets, particularly in the Department of Defense, are also entitlements. If you're going to make material changes, one would think that the 70% would be a good place, or the 75% would be a good place to start, particularly if you're trying to equilibrate the pain across various parts of federal spending.
I think that is fair. Now, I will say that we did make some pretty substantial cuts to Medicare as part of the Affordable Care Act. And one of the ultimate political ironies in that, well, a couple of things. One is, you will hear the Republican refrain on this, that, oh, we don't need more taxes, we need to cut entitlements. We get those under control. The Democrats, they're just not willing to do that. They're standing in our way. That's a load of hooey, actually. What the Republicans want is they want Democrats to cut entitlements so they can blame us for it. Because, they've been in charge of the House for going on 4 years now. Maybe I was on vacation for a week and missed it. But I haven't seen the entitlement reform bill come out of the House Republicans. A budget document is just a, fantasy document. Where is the entitlement reform piece from if this is what they care about? Well, they haven't done it. And then, of course, the one time that we did do it as part of healthcare reform, it was probably the #1 issue that they attacked us on in the 2010 election quite effectively. And the second thing is Medicare actually is costing less than expected, and is a big part of the reason that the deficit's down to $500 billion when it was projected to be about $1 trillion. So we have made that decision. Do we need to do more of it? Sure. I also, was supportive of the cut in retirement pay, the 1% reduction in the COLA that got thrown out. I mean, we threw out the 1% reduction in the COLA and added an 8th year of sequestration. I mean, that really struck me as a very, very bad deal and emblematic of the problem that we have.
Do you think it would make any progress on things like military retirement reform and military health care reform, TRICARE, if instead of treating that issue in isolation within the military budget, DoD budget, if that was linked to broader entitlement reform, linked to long-term changes in Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid?
No, we might. It's still a very difficult issue, but yeah, I think the entire mandatory spending, that should be all part of the same conversation. I'll agree with that.
All right. Any question?
Megan Eckstein with Defense Daily. I spoke to one of your Democratic colleagues yesterday who was frustrated that at the subcommittee level, there were a lot of plus-ups in the markups, but not much of an effort to find ways to take out money. I wondered if you saw that on the full committee level, and also if you see sort of any way that Wednesday will play out where you're not going to have to take all that money out of readiness, if there's any other place where you see that money coming from.
I think that's an apt description of where we're at, and I think it's unfortunate. I think, we are desperately moving things around to find those 1-year savings to protect everything in FY15. And 16, 17, 18 are coming. You know, so like I said, I'm still examining that to see what options we could put out there to try to take a more realistic approach, but it certainly doesn't look like the direction the majority has taken, that they're punting on all those difficult issues, which I think is unfortunate.
You spoke about, deciding which amendments you would bring up, versus, being possibly crushed. By proposing certain ones. Have you made the calculation that you will not be crushed if you bring up the brac amendment? And what is the likely outcome of that?
Yeah, no. I guess it's more a matter of how many times can you be crushed. I've been working on brac for a while, and just want to at least start that conversation. But those are the choices. But no, I don't have any illusions on what the outcome of the brac amendment's going to be on the floor.
Yeah, you talk about the parochial interest. When you have a cap, the parochial interest, do they at some point begin to cancel each other off? Because if you're going to do one thing, it's going to cost somebody else something. And is it, based on what you're saying though, it sounds to me like they're deferring to O&M, which doesn't really have a strong constituent to back it. So it looks like we're looking at cashing out of there.
Yeah, A, they're deferring to O&M. B, they're using the fact that most of those savings that I've talked about, A10, cruiser layup, guard changes, personnel changes, have much bigger 5-year numbers than 1-year numbers to sort of just wiggle their way under the FY15 cap, but then create the bow wave for the next 4 to 5 years that's going to come. So that means 16 is going to be much more difficult.
So is there logic though in the sense what Todd was talking about, the offloading into OCO? You still have OCO as that valve, that relief valve. Are we going to see a giant, $10 billion shift like we did 2 years ago into OCO of just O&M, like Senator Inouye did?
I think that's quite possible. I don't know if it's going to happen or not, but I think that is a logical thing to assume.
The President's just returned from his trip to the Western Pacific, and of course a lot of us were struck back in January 2012 when the Defense Strategic Guidance was released, and the administration said we're going to rebalance toward the Pacific, and a lot of us in the WOM community viewed that as a concern that greater effort needed to be made to preserve stability in that corridor. We talked about whether to keep A-10s or not keep A-10s, 11 carriers versus 10 carriers, building 2 submarines a year versus 1. It seems to me that one of the ways, in fact, perhaps the only way to get beyond the parochial industrial-based jobs issue is to have an argument for why we need this particular number in this particular part of the world. And during the Cold War, for example, in our efforts to convince the Soviets not to engage in coercion or aggression in Europe, the military, along with our allies, developed a concept that was called air-land battle. And some of the particulars were even though our ground forces were in the southern part of West Germany, we would reinforce in the north because that's where the Dutch and the Belgians were. To get there fast, we pre-positioned equipment. The way they would fight is to not only deal with the frontline enemy forces, but to create capabilities to attack the reinforcements coming out of the Soviet Union. The Navy said, well, we've got to keep the sea lines open, so they developed something called the outer air battle, which required a certain number of carriers and aircraft pushing forward to keep Soviet bombers from getting into the Atlantic. And the Marines pre-positioned equipment in Norway to protect the flank in Germany. We have nothing like that in terms of an understanding of how we would go about preserving stability in the Western Pacific. I've heard options mentioned about where we would position forces in the first island chain to convince China that it has no incentive in engaging in acts of coercion or aggression. Other people have talked about offshore balancing and blockades. but we really haven't seen a serious discussion or presentation on the part of the military in terms of how it's going to execute this rebalancing. And it would seem to me the absence of that, certainly I've talked to a number of our allies from Japan and Australia and other areas, and the question, well, how is the American military going to go about rebalancing? Because it has important implications for the type of forces, the scale of forces, where they're based, what we want to ask of our allies. And absent some understanding, don't we risk wasting a lot of resources by buying things that we don't need and perhaps not buying enough of the things that we might need?
Well, that's the other big challenge in all of this is forget the money for the moment, as big a problem as it is. What is our strategy going forward? And it's an entirely different situation because the country during the Cold War was clearly focused on the Soviet Union as a threat. So all of those things you just described, national security was a big deal. Being able to stand up to the Soviet Union was a huge political issue. We don't have a similar dynamic now. National security is not the big political issue. And in large part because we don't face that all-consuming threat anymore. And that's a good thing, by the way. China is not the Soviet Union. Russia, for whatever we're doing right now, is not the Soviet Union. We don't have an expansionist power out there that we really have to sit there and worry about attacking us. So why would we build a strategy and spend a ton of money as if China was the Soviet Union? They're not. But what are they? And then how do you then build a national security strategy around preserving peace and stability in Asia? Personally, I think, with both China and, yes, Russia, even now, even with the difficulties we're having, the long-term interest we have is to sort of bring them into the community of nations, to make them part of solving broader global problems. And believe it or not, that has happened to some extent. I mean, Russia has continued to be fairly helpful with us dealing with Afghanistan in terms of supply routes. They've worked with us on non-proliferation. They even agreed with us on getting rid of Gaddafi in Libya. And you can argue this a bunch of different ways, but helped to give us an out, at least short term, on the Syria issue on chemical weapons. China is now working more closely with Taiwan than they ever have before. Yes, they still have disputes about those islands, but I don't think we should lock in a national security strategy that has a Cold War mentality about Asia. The Asia pivot is much more about maintaining a presence to build up alliances. Everyone says, oh, it's all about containing China. It's not all about containing China. It's about India as a rising power. We want to have a positive relationship there. The president just reconnected with the Philippines to some extent. That's an important relationship. Vietnam is a growing economy. Japan, South Korea. It's about building relationships with all of those different countries in there that is to our benefit both economically and in terms of long-term national security and their interests. We will now have partners to help us in whatever comes up in that region. So I think part of the Asia pivot is that it is not primarily a military strategy, or it's certainly not solely a military strategy. It's an engagement strategy to use all the component parts of our foreign policy. Now, what do you do with the defense piece of it? And part of it is, mill to mill. Some of the training stuff, again, that builds up partnerships and builds up capacity of people that can help us with problems. Having a presence, that's why it's so important with the carriers. But I think the hope is that as you build up those partnerships, that has the effect of stopping China from doing anything overly aggressive in some of these territorial disputes, much more than air-sea battle. If China looks at it and says, okay, there's 15 countries in our neighborhood here, and we rely on them for this, and this, and we want to keep the peace, and if we go stepping in here and creating a problem and blow up those 15 relationships, then we've created problems that aren't worth it. That's more the containment strategy. That's nowhere near as much fun as what you just said. particularly from a military strategy standpoint. But I think it better reflects the world that we live in today versus the Cold War world that we lived in during the era of the Soviet Union.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that? So, the 2012 Defense Strategic Guidance that Andrew talked about, that came out, DoD developed that before sequestration went into effect, right? And so resources are more constrained since then. And the world has changed since then, even just recently with what we're seeing going on with Russia and Ukraine. So do you think the pivot still makes sense? Do you think it's still possible, realistic, that we could increase or shift our presence to the Asia-Pacific region without sacrificing our presence in Europe and the Middle East? It seems like we keep getting pulled back to the Europe and Middle East.
Yeah, I think the pivot makes sense in all the way that I just described it, in terms of emphasis, in terms of diplomacy, maybe in terms of development, in terms of military. It's not even so much about moving money around as it is being focused on that region and having the particular strategy is the one that I just laid out. Is that undermined to the extent that we get pulled back into Europe and get pulled back into the Middle East? Yes, but it's not eliminated. I mean, that strategy of building the partnerships in Asia continues to be an important factor.
But with the reduced resources, can we still do all of that? Or do we have to scale back?
Oh, well, obviously we have to scale back. It's where and how. And like I said, a lot of what I just described in terms of building those relationships with those countries in Asia is not resource intensive. It's, having our Secretary of State make trips out there and build it, having the President go there. Mill to mill, I guess, involves a little bit of resources, but it's not that resource intensive. It's not that resource intensive a strategy, I guess is what I would say. It's not, we're pivoting to take on a military enemy. We're pivoting to build relationships in order to, broaden our influence through partnerships.
Question?
One of Todd's slides indicated DoD isn't officially putting civilian personnel cuts on the table, but at least with Secretary Hagel's desire to cut 20 to 25% of headquarters staff, and you start to hear some rumblings even within the service organizations that civilian personnel cuts, at least in the long term, should be on the table. Do you have a sense that there would be support in Congress to give the authority to the Secretary and to the service secretaries to actually increase the voluntary incentives and make it more, or to ease that possibility of civilian personnel cuts so it becomes more of a voluntary process?
Yeah. Again, I have a hard time speaking to what their support in Congress for, but I think that should be a part of what we do, is expanding that authority. And I would also agree that there, whatever it may have said in that slide about what they'll cut and won't cut, as you said, the Secretary's already said he's looking at, 20, 25%, personnel cuts in the Pentagon and the combatant command. So I think there's a greater willingness to do that, and I think part of how we get there is to give them greater authority. I'd agree with that.
I think last question in the back here.
Very simple. When the Pentagon tells Congress about risk, does the Congress understand what the Pentagon means when it says it's accepting risk? Risk of what? Commissions, opens?
Yeah, I mean, I think risk is a term broadly open to interpretation by a lot of people. And I think it means different things. I mean, and it's sort of hard to describe because if we have to cut our naval fleet, how much does that increase the risk that North Korea will start a war with South Korea? How much does that increase the risk that there will be an arms race in Japan? If we have to make cuts in our intel side, how much does that increase the risk that we'll miss something from Al Qaeda and they'll be able to strike us? I think we understand it. It's not calculable in a simple math sort of way. I guess that's the great thing about risk. It's just risk until it happens. And if you have all those risks and it doesn't happen, well, great. But that's also the bad thing about risk, is as I think Andrew said at the start, we can't eliminate it. And how do you know which one of your actions reduce it by how much? That's always going to be highly debatable. So I think Congress understands it. I think they would debate. I think each member would debate aggressively with DoD which actions lead to which risks, and also which risks are more acceptable. So it's a complicated and it's a debate that lacks specifics and clarity. It's very fluid, I guess, is the way I would put it.
We've exhausted our time. Some thanks are in order. First, thanks to all of you for joining us today. Appreciate your coming. Look forward to seeing you again in the future. Also like to thank the staff at CSBA and Congressman Smith's staff for doing all the work they've done to make this run so smoothly and set this up so well. I'd like to thank my colleague Todd Harrison, the budget guru of DC, at least the defense budget guru, for his work on this effort. And most of all, I hope you'll join me in thanking Congressman Smith for some very insightful and thoughtful remarks. Thank you.